In this video, we're going to look at character traits and how they exist on a continuum. To review, characterization is the name for the techniques a writer uses to reveal the personality of characters to the reader. Characterization is achieved in a number of different ways. Character traits exist on a continuum, or a scale, with opposite traits at the end and a whole range of possibilities in between. For example, the character the giver is presented initially as a man who is in control, not only of himself, but of the knowledge of the entire community. He controls not only the memories of the community, but also their transmission. For example, the giver's trait of being in control is responsive to circumstances. Just saying that the giver is or is not self-controlled would not come near to telling the whole story. In the example shown on the screen, we see an example of the giver feeling out of control. The memories are controlling him and causing him pain. So here are some examples of continuums. The giver, you could say that he is self-controlled, but at other times he seems overwhelmed or somewhere in between. At the very beginning of the story, we might consider Jonas gullible, but as the story goes on, he becomes more and more insightful. At the very beginning of the book, Jonas is extremely honest, but as time goes on and circumstances change, he becomes increasingly deceptive. Lastly, at the beginning of the novel, Jonas is a follower and depends heavily on others, but as the story goes on and circumstances change, he becomes more of a leader and even more independent. The assignment is going to ask you to write a description of how Jonas's behaviors vary along one of these continuums or another that you identify. Let's take a look at some examples of how you could start this assignment. For example, if you chose to write about how Jonas can sometimes be gullible and is sometimes insightful, you might begin by saying, at the beginning of the story, Jonas behaved in ways that would characterize him as gullible. As the story continued, his behavior changed and he became more insightful, for example. And then you would have to give examples of how Jonas was gullible, how he was slightly less gullible, and examples of how he was insightful. Remember, you need to write an entire page. Here's a second example. Jonas can be both honest and deceptive. This depends on the circumstances he finds himself in, for example. And then you would need to give examples of how Jonas is honest, how he's deceptive, and how sometimes he's somewhere in between. Remember, you need to write at least a full page. And the last example. Jonas can be a follower and dependent on others. He can also be a leader and act and think independently. This depends on the circumstances he finds himself in, for example. So then you would need to give examples of how Jonas is a follower and is sometimes dependent on others. Examples of how his behavior is kind of in the middle of this spectrum. And examples of how his behavior is on the far right end of the spectrum, showing him as an independent leader. Remember, you need to write at least one page.